We are back at KOTESOL International Conference 2013 with one of our featured speakers, Curtis Kelly. Welcome.
Hi. Well, thank you.
How has your conference been so far?
Oh, it's been awesome. You know, with 3 presentations, I haven't really been able to attend that many other presentations, but the one I could, I
You gave 3 presentations,
yeah.
And one of those you actually wound up giving twice.
Well, those are 2 different presentations. One on how neuroscience can solve classroom problems, then a Pecha Kucha, and that was the hardest of the 3. And one on how preschool builds better adults, more successful adults.
Very diverse topics. How would you characterize your specialty or your area of interest?
Neuroscience.
Neuroscience.
All 3 of these presentations are related to developing the brain through educational approaches. And so neuroscience is my main area of interest.
And what were the main takeaways from your presentations, and what has your interest these days especially?
Yeah, well, my interest is still in neuroscience. In fact, I just finished a 6-month research leave where I studied the development of executive function, in other words, cognitive abilities in children, and how that's done through preschool, and the influence of stress, small little classroom stress. It's not like big, sick, dangerous stress. The influence of stress on learning. Does it help or hinder learning? People always say a little stress helps learning. Other people write, well, stress impedes learning. So I tried to find out which it was.
Where are you on the
answer
question?
is very interesting.
What is the answer?
Both. Our body, and when we're stressed. The stress could be something like a game that you're enjoying, a competition, but your autonomic nervous system gets activated. You release cortisol, which is a hormone, and cortisol causes your nerves in the area related to the stress to be super sensitive and to learn everything. Then it shuts them off from other learning for the next hour. So you're very good at learning stuff that's connected to the stress, like maybe the game contents or something like that. But then for the next hour,
the after effects
is shut down to preserve that learning.
So, I'm going to take a quick pause. Stress was,
this had nothing to do with my presentation.
That's fine. So what are the implications of that for classroom teaching?
That if you're going to do something that'll be stressful, like in a happy or a kind of negative stress way, make sure that the language is connected somehow to the stressor, and it'll be learned more deeply. Also be aware that if you're going to scold a student and upset them, you can't expect them to remember the stuff that you talked about for the next hour after that, because their nerves will be shut down.
So it would seem like it's never worthwhile to get angry, to cause your students stress not related to a learning issue.
In terms of learning and cognitive performance, you're right. But, teachers will tell you sometimes you got to get angry. I don't make that student shut up so the rest of the students can study, so it's kind of hard to judge.
Is your study specifically related to ELT or teaching in general? It is ELT.
Well, I think it's teaching in general, because my personal interest, of course, I'm a language teacher. So I'm interested in how language teaching and neuroscience, where they intersect. But I think it's related to all education in general, the things that I study.
Now, one of the things you hear a lot is that women have certain neurological advantages over men. Is it the corpus callosum that is supposedly larger in women, and so the left and the right brain? Is there any truth to that? Are there differences between the way men and women learn language?
As far as I know, there's truth to the size difference, and I don't know the effects of that. But I guess something else related to stress is very interesting. I don't know the effects of that on thinking or brain development. I've noticed that, for example, things like heartwarming stories or emotional stories, generally with, it's really dangerous to say this, but with younger students at least, no, never mind.
Oh, you can't leave us hanging.
Okay. It seems that when I do presentations, I don't know if this is cultural or because of the corpus callosum difference. You're using something with words and it becomes emotional women seem to respond to it more easily than men do. And sometimes I felt this way myself when I'm thinking about words on maybe one side of my brain, something emotional comes in and maybe needs the other side for processing. It's almost painful. It's like I'm not sure which way to go or how to do that processing at the same time.
And what about gender issues related to stress?
Okay. Women are smarter than men.
I think at least half the population would agree with that, probably more.
This is something I just learned from Adele Diamond, her research. She's been studying stress and cognitive function. Cognitive function means things like working memory, your ability to handle different ideas at the same time, cognitive flexibility, things like that. And she found, well, we know that dopamine levels in the brain, there's an optimal level of dopamine. And when you're at that optimum level, your cognitive processing is also optimal. It works very well. It's like a Yerkes-Bateson curve. A little bit too much dopamine, you're pushed out, and not enough, you're pushed under. And women will have a naturally higher level of dopamine in the resting state than men do because they have estrogen. And estrogen raises dopamine levels. So when there's no outside influence, women are a little bit better, have better cognitive function than men do. But with a little bit of stress, women are pushed out and men are pushed in. So men do better with stress and women invariably do worse.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So, again, relating it to a classroom, you're better, if you're going to stress someone out, stress the guy out, but don't stress the woman out.
Well, just
Or
a
don't, not as
little bit
much.
of stress. Again, that could be like who can answer this question more quickly, you or your neighbor? It could be like a game type activity.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
What were the main points of you mentioned nursery school or your very young early education?
Some fascinating stuff. I talked about how what determines success in life, and we used to think it was IQ a long time ago. How smart you are would determine whether you succeed in college and other things, but that's not the case at all. It's character, it's conscientiousness, it's openness, tolerance, flexibility, these kinds of things. The amazing thing that was discovered in a couple studies was poor kids from the same community, those who go to preschool compared to those who don't, are much more successful their whole life. Even at 30 years old, a child from the same community with the same basic home environment that went to preschool would be 4 times more likely at 30 to have graduated from college, and 5 times less likely to be using public assistance, welfare, medical care, things like that. And we believe that happens because preschool, in that age period, is where what's called executive function is developed. Executive function of prefrontal cortex thinking skills. They involve like your working memory, the ability to hold many ideas in mind at the same time. Inhibitory control, the ability to hold yourself back and not get angry right away or to jump in on something. Cognitive flexibility, which is tolerance and being able to see things from many sides. And focus, giving focus to something or shifting focus. And these skills seem to be most likely to be strengthened for like preschool age children. And preschool and certain activities in preschool strengthen these skills and helps the child for their whole life.
As opposed to someone who's not going to a preschool, not getting so much social interaction, so the skill is developing in the same context, but maybe it's developing at home to just a parent, in which case it develops very differently.
Yeah. And kids, you can still develop these skills later, but it seems like that time the kids are really sensitive. And it seems to be from interactive activities, project work, group work. We think that's what causes these skills to be developed.
And you would
the kids at home don't get that.
You would think governments and societies would really want to encourage preschool attendance, but as an American, I know funding is not always
there have
supported.
Been movements in America, even from private investors, to increase preschool for children, because we spend so much money on incarceration facilities. If that same amount of money was spent in preschool, and again, we have evidence that kids that graduate from high school, that don't drop out, that do these things that preschool might be connected to, are far less likely to be in prison than kids that don't graduate, the dropouts or whatnot.
Getting back to stress a little bit, you mentioned you did a pecha and that was the most, I forget what word, but that can be a very stressful thing.
Yeah.
Have you given a pecha before?
This is my first time one? Yesterday.
How was that experience? How was your stress level? How did you deal with it?
I was very stressed because I had a presentation just an hour before, so I really didn't have time to practice my pecha before I did it. It's very hard. Pecha is much harder than other types of speeches. And because it's not just like a shortened presentation, academic content. It has to be something that influences or inspires or moves people. So it's a whole different result that we're seeking. Mine was titled, I Deal in Drugs. And I pretend I'm a drug dealer as instead of a teacher. The idea is the drug I'm trying to get out there is dopamine. The drug related to happiness, drive, reward, and deeper learning. So they're telling teachers they should be moving, inspiring, telling stories to students to get dopamine out there so the language will be learned at a deeper level. So I deal drugs, hormone dopamine, not teach English these days.
So I assume for the hour after that presentation you were not a good learner, not very sharp.
Right.
Needed some wine immediately.
Oh, you remember well. You're a quick learner. Yeah, I need some wine, exactly.
Are there any things that a person can do, knowing what's going to happen neurologically, to more effectively cope with stress in learning and in living?
Very good question. The effects, if you do look at the research on stress, different people have different reactions. There's all kinds of other influences. And one is just knowing how to handle stress, knowing how to identify it, recognize it, developing strategies for managing it. So we know the cognitive process of thinking has a huge effect on stress, how you perceive it. If somebody yells at you and you think, oh, I did something really bad, your stress level will go more than, well, that person's upset about something. I wonder if I can help them. So cognitive processing itself has a huge effect.
I saw a research study recently that was along those lines, I think, of how it's not the stress itself that causes the problem, it's how you feel about the stress. Yeah. And if you approach it from okay, this is a great opportunity to challenge myself with a pecha as opposed to, I'm terrified and I might fail, that it has very different results.
That's a good point, yeah. So, there's many things we can do about it, even genetic differences. People with certain genes feel the effects of stress more than others. So there's many things that affect stress. And of course, prior stress, tiredness, alcohol, there's other environmental influences like that as well.
Anything else from your presentations or anything you've encountered in the conference you'd like to share?
It's too bad the movie recording didn't work, because my first presentation, the main one, was on using neuroscience to solve problems in the classroom. And I really talked about memory problems, forgetting, interference, the more interesting misattribution, where we can't have the memory, we can't remember where we heard it from, and then false memory, which is the ability that you can implant other memories in other people. And
wait, can you tell me what that means, to implant memory in someone?
There's a person called Elizabeth Loftus. And when she was 14, her mother drowned in a pool at her home. It was a very traumatic event for her. 30 years later, at 44, she was talking to her relatives about the day she came home and she found her mother floating face down in the pool. And all her cousins and uncles and aunts started looking at her with this funny look. They said, you didn't find her. Aunt so-and-so did. You weren't even here that day. But she remembered the event very vividly. And she said, how did I get that memory? Then she remembered. A few weeks before that, her 90-year-old uncle had told her, you're the one that found, your mother. He was wrong, of course. And at that time she denied it. No, it wasn't me. But in the weeks after that, that memory started going around, and she began to believe it and actually build details for it as she incorporated it into her memory system. So that led her to study implanted memories, just like her uncle had implanted on her, and how especially witness testimony is so unreliable, and how, for example, the 300 people that have been released from prison because of DNA testing showed they weren't guilty after 30 years in prison. In 80% of the cases, they went to prison because of expert testimony against him. Someone said, I know he did because I saw him. When in many cases, it's just because the police showed the picture of this guy, maybe over 2 weeks or 3 times, and the memory started thinking, that's the guy.
It's something I wonder about. I mean, the brain is so good at imagining things. We daydream all the time. We dream at night, and sometimes it feels very real. How do we always know what's a real memory and what's a memory of a dream or a daydream?
Wow, good question. Yeah, well, there are some cultures like the Hopi Indians that think the past is just part of the dream too. Don't separate dream from memory, but yeah, I can't really answer that question. But one thing, after studying Elizabeth Loftus' work, it doesn't matter how clear, how many details, how emotional, how strong a person believes a memory is. That doesn't mean it's right. And in fact, our brain is very weak at recording memories when we're in this traumatic condition, upset by something. That's when our memory system is the most broken. So, who raped me or who killed who or something in this traumatic experience, it may not be right.
And there must be so much post-processing that goes on as you relive that experience again and again.
As somebody said, every time you rekindle a memory, you're making it again, because you're rekindling that network system. And anytime you activate a network system, it causes new synapses to form or shed or whatever. And our brain is constantly taking memory and manipulating it and trying to combine it with other memories. Because for survival, we don't have time to remember every single instance we encountered the word or image of, like, tiger. If we meet a tiger in the jungle or something, we don't have time to go through every single memory individually. So you just sort of make this gist: tigers are dangerous, I gotta run. And that's been for our advantage. So memory is constantly amalgamating and reforming while we're sleeping, making this kind of general understanding.
So how does this stuff relate to language learning, both as teachers, what should we keep in mind, and as language learners?
Well, one thing Elizabeth Loftus said, false memory is a big problem, but maybe it could be a tool. Maybe we could tell our learners, if we have in a third-year class or something, remember when you're a first-year student how much you love to study vocabulary? And we say that a couple times. Oh, yeah. Like I'm doing that with my daughter. She's 5 years old. She's always hated vegetables, like salad. But since she was 4, I started telling her every couple of months, remember when you were a baby how much you loved salad? And now she started eating salad first.
Wow.
So I'm using false memory.
She'll see this on YouTube someday and say, Dad!
That could be, or she might, another thing related to false memory is repressed memories. I'm sure everybody's heard cases of people that have these disorders or psychological conditions, and through therapy it was discovered they repressed memories of abuse in their childhood or something like that. Loftus questioned that too and found there's no literature that shows how memories could be repressed. In fact, for a traumatic event, we tend to remember it, not suppress it. And her research found that a lot of the therapists are actually implanting these memories. If you remember when you were little, did anybody ever touch you? Like your father? And hearing this one time, then later, maybe again later, would actually cause, in many cases, that memory to be implanted.
So, is she saying that memories don't get repressed?
She said that she could find no clinical evidence or experimental evidence that said the memories get repressed.
Wow.
So, I'm not really sure.
Interesting.
She's got a great TED Talk that she just did a couple weeks ago.
I forget the word for it. It's a method of memorizing lots of words by associating images with it. Are you familiar? Like someone will say, okay, what's your name, what's your name, what's your name? And they'll remember everybody's name.
Mnemonics.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was one of those hard to pronounce words.
That's related to memory. That we cue memory to other things. In fact, even better than like picture sometimes is movement. When you're studying vocabulary, make a gesture for it. And there's this evidence that shows that movement and learning are somehow closely connected. So making gestures for vocabulary words that you practice might lead to better retention. A study, I think it was, here's my misattribution going on. A study, I think it was Reading, England. They did a study where two groups of people studying something. One group chewed gum, and the gum chewers remembered 36% more of the details than the non-gum chewers.
Interesting.
Well, you asked, how does this relate to our classroom and teaching? First of all, memory is so malleable, and it's not good with details. So you have to be careful if we're making tests we don't ask detailed questions, memory questions. In fact, abnormal memory questions, like what date did John, what was the name of John's dog, or something, detailed questions. We have to ask more gist questions. Was the main person in the story happy or sad or frustrated? Things that we're more likely to remember. We have to be more forgiving for students that don't remember things. We have to understand that things like sleep are critical for memory formation. And maybe just telling our students to get sleep at night. You know,
it seems
an hour of sleep is worth an hour of study.
It seems like we're doing a lot wrong. we're making our students sleep deprived, we're asking them for details, we're making them stressed, and then...
And if you think about it, conferences like this one have a huge effect on memory because all the things that impair memory, lack of sleep, stress, alcohol, in some cases caffeine.
That must be why they make the program, so we can go back after and say, oh, that's what it was about.
Yeah, the proceedings, yeah.
All right. Well, this has been a really interesting discussion, and I will, if I don't remember it, I can watch the recording, but I'm confident I will.
Please get some sleep tonight.
Okay.
Yeah, it's such a fascinating field. There's so much for us to learn from neuroscience. I'd really love to help set up a conference on neuroscience where teachers, not neuroscientists, are talking about neuroscience like we're doing in Japan. But I'd love to set one up with KOTESOL.
I'd love to invite students to that.
Yeah.
You know, they're on the front lines. Where, if people want to see kind of examples of this kind of theory being put into practice by language teachers, is that out there anywhere? I structured this lesson, I created this based on the theories.
Question. That's a good question. I think there's just people writing about that on an individual level. I don't know of any books that are relevant for our environment, Asia.
What about in your teaching? Like, what do you teach neuroscience or do you teach language?
I teach language.
Okay.
But I use like gesture techniques for teaching vocabulary. I tell students to get sleep. I love setting up teaching or being involved in teaching projects where maybe my Japanese colleague is having them do research. I give them training for a presentation on that research, where there's like a cross the curriculum connection. Active learning we know is very effective. Another effective is something called space learning, where you're going to teach an hour or something, you teach 30 minutes now, and then 30 minutes maybe a day later or an hour later or whatever. It's a bit hard to arrange, but it's much more effective than teaching something else.
What's your take on attention span? How long is the average attention span
Well,
of a
I've
human?
heard, you probably know as much about that as I do. I've heard it's like 10 minutes or 15 minutes, but...
Yeah, I heard something like your age plus something or minus something minutes.
Really?
Yeah. But you hear a lot of things.
Well, you seem to be pretty good at attention, or at least you look like you're listening.
Well, that's another component of this is listening.
I don't think it's right to say attention span is so many minutes, because I think it really depends on the content, the learner, the situation, how many other things they've done that day. When I'm watching a movie like World War Z or something, my attention span is going to go till the end of the movie.
Yeah.
So
And also if it's a flow event, if you're a violinist and you're playing the violin,
Exactly.
you're totally unaware of time. If you're stuck in a high school English class in Korea, the clock is moving incredibly slowly.
Yeah. And even listening to presentations, if it doesn't relate to me, my mind goes into default mode. Default mode is when we start daydreaming. And actually, daydreaming is planning for the future. But if it's relevant to me, I'm going to be paying attention because I want to follow it. So how does attention span work there? Then other factors. I teach presentations, so one is moving across the stage. Our brain is built to attend to things that are changing. Somebody's changing their voice or the format of their presentation. Our brains are built to pick up difference. When everything stops changing, we go into default mode and start paying attention.
Because I think a lot of presentation coaches would say, no, you should stand still and don't distract your audience. But you're saying,
I have no idea, but I certainly don't say that. I say use the stage as a way to punctuate your presentation. You change topics, move over a little bit. When you tell a story, lean forward a little bit so the audience feels that you're getting closer.
Right. Feels like an interaction.
It's a powerful technique. And moving, look at Steve Jobs, his presentations on YouTube. He's always kind of walking back and forth on the stage. Not constantly, but in ways that sort of changes the setup.
And attention span, I think, is also something that I wonder if it can be taught. Because one of the things that strikes me about Asia is Asian students will sit at a desk and appear to be studying for a much longer period of time than I'm used to from the United States.
That's an interesting question.
My wife can sit down and study in a way that I wonder if it's, sometimes I feel like America, I don't know Western culture, but American culture is kind of a little bit ADHD. It's so...
Or is it because we were growing up, we were raised in classes where students speak out and get involved. So just to sit and listen to a lecture is not that much a part of our experience.
Right.
So we have trouble with it, unlike Koreans that get that from junior high school, and Japanese get that from junior high school on up.
Right.
Wow, that's interesting.
Lots of interesting questions out there. Well, I hope we can continue this conversation sometime. And in the meantime, if people want to check out your work or stuff, where should they go online?
Well, I've got an article in the Tech coming out next week. I'll have some proceedings in here for the KOTESOL 2 2013.
All right, well, we'll Google you.
I
We'll
don't
find
do
some
a
links.
whole lot of writing. I tend to do more speaking because I think I get to more people that way. So, yeah. I guess Google.
All right, we'll find you. All right, well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. It's been fun.
All right, that was great.
Kind of interesting stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is.
I can't,
And it really just seems like stuff that should be put into practice, and we're just doing so many things wrong.
that's where neuroscience is like this whole new area of darkness light's been shined on. How does learning occur? You've been going to conference probably as long as I have, and how much of it is just language education, government policy, and linguistics, and the stuff that we kind of already know, more or less, or it doesn't really have much influence on what we do in the classroom. But suddenly there's neuroscience explaining why some students are there, they study, but they can't learn because they're not getting sleep.
And you'd like to think if we have, science that we know to be true, that we would formulate policy on that, like the preschool thing. It's win-win-win. It's in everybody's
policy
interest.
in America, as I understand it. But it's influenced policy in America. But how much, I'm not sure. But even just for me, knowing that something like grit determines success in life, and I'm in this program where we really have the students given this terrible work where they have to stay up late at night and do all this work for research and to put on these presentations, and then go to America and do the presentations at Microsoft. And I said, gee, that's too much for young people. They're not getting enough sleep. It's too hard. But now, after reading about grit and conscientiousness and how personality traits are so important, it's the right thing.
So is grit nature or nurture?
Yeah. I think it's both, but probably more nature. You know, we don't say nature and nurture anymore.
What do we say?
Neuroscience. Because now we're realizing it's not an either or. That nature, your genetic system, and nature work together to make something different. Here's an example. There's a certain gene whose name I can't remember. 10% of the people that have it are convicted of misdemeanor crimes sometime in their life. And there's a certain kind of household condition. If you're raised by somebody who's a criminal, 10% of those people will get involved in misdemeanor or higher level crimes at some time in their life. If you have that gene and that environmental condition, you're 40% probability. So that's where the gene and the environment work together to make something even bigger. So nature or nurture, we have a different view now. They're working together to make our genes express themselves.
But there's still, wouldn't you say it's never, or it's rarely black or white, but there's a spectrum. Yeah. And you could say, this seems like homosexuality. Is homosexuality more nature or nurture? I think a lot of people would say it's more nature. I know some people would say no, and nurture maybe isn't the right word, but is it genetic or is it conditioning?
Well, there might be a genetic condition that influences from nature cause to be expressed.
Right.
Make it more likely it'll be expressed.
But there's always an interaction between the two.
Not always. I don't know. I don't know either. It's a good question. There's some things that are probably much more, as you said, nature determined, like certain illnesses are genetic, and it's very hard to avoid them no matter how you live.
But if you live healthier, there are certain things you can do to maximize your chances, or certain things you can do to.
Isn't that cool?
Yeah, really. So
it's changing my life.
This is how long have you been into all this stuff? How long have you been into neuroscience?
About 15 years. It started by podcasts. I was interested. I read a couple of books. The good starter book is Brain Rules by John Medina. I started listening to the Brain Science podcast.
I'm sorry, get Bob.
What was that?
Memory.
Oh, the Brain Science podcast.
Oh.
This doctor, Carolyn Graham, is that something like that, does interviews with people who write books on brain science. I don't have enough time to read, or enough energy to read every book on brain science. But I could listen to a 90-minute interview where the author talks about the main points, or she does, and learn a lot from that. So that's really the basis of my training for the first 5 years or so is from that. I say 15 years, I say probably more 10 years.
Yeah, if it was a podcast, it was more like 10 years.
10 years ago I started getting interested in neuroscience, and that podcast series was really listening to maybe 100 or so of those podcasts.
Is it still being produced?
My best education.
Okay, I'll definitely check that out.
I'd just go back and listen from number 10 or so, because the first few were kind of, some of the early ones were the best for me.
All right, well, this will be on YouTube. I'll turn it into a podcast too, maybe.